#MeToo and Mar Hist, tackling the silences about seafaring women's subjective sexualities. This is by Stanley. The aim of this paper is to briefly explore why there has been silence about women's subjective sexualities at sea, why this gender-related silence matters in maritime historiography, and what is now being done in the 21st century to redress this occlusion. In this presentation, I'll be talking about four things. I'll do an introduction, then I'll be talking about the key reasons for this silence, then I'll be explaining why this silence matters, and I'll be ending by talking about new inclusions of women and new trends. This is slide 5. The paper I'll be talking about today includes the following. I'll be talking about the UK Merchant Service as well as the Royal Navy. I'll be speaking about women as seafarers, not shore-based women, though they do relate of course to women in the maritime sphere and in the wider society. I'll be covering the 19th to the 21st centuries, which means there's much variation, and I'll be speaking broadly rather than profoundly. The relevance of all this is that women today are 2% of the world's 1.2 million seafarers. There's about 3,000 in the Merchant Navy and the same number in the Royal Navy, of whom about 600 are at sea at this point. Slide 6. This is part of the introduction, and I'll be talking about a case study which we could refer to as the No Sex at Sea contract. Heterosexual sex acts at sea, or the possibility of them, as we know, have been crucial to shipboard social and labour relations. The case I'm going to be talking about is the only published evidence about the consequences of a sex act for a seafaring woman that I have ever come across in 30 years of research into women's maritime history. This is how it goes. In London at the Thames Police Court on the 30th of October 1857, Captain Reuben Carr of the ship Edward Oliver was summoned by the husband of Ellen Gibbs, a stewardess, for refusing to pay Ellen's wages. For the plaintiff, it was said that in May 1857, Mrs. and Mr. Gibbs were on a return voyage from Melbourne after taking immigrants out to Australia. When they were off the Chinchas Islands near Peru, she gave birth to twins, but in 6 days she was up again and resumed her duties. By contrast, Captain Carr's barrister contended that the accouchement of the woman and the attention she had to pay to her infants incapacitated her from doing the duties of a stewardess. After listening to the case, the judge found, I think this was tongue-in-cheek, there was no contract forbidding intercourse. He said the risk must be on the owners of the ship if they thought proper to engage a man and his wife on the same ship, because of the assumption that of course they would have sex. The outcome was good for Ellen. She got her full wages back, £28.10, which is roughly £79 in today's money. Slide 7. The No Sex at Sea contract. So the Ellen Gibbs case to me seems very important because it brings into focus two things. Implicitly, sex acts at sea, and also a key managerial reason for excluding women seafarers of childbearing age, the potential labour shortages that pregnancy and childbirth would bring. So Ellen's voice is absent, and this is telling and typical. So many women's voices aren't heard. Her husband put her case for her in court, but we know that her desire for economic justice did lead her to appear in court and to take this risk, to have her private life discussed and thereby revealed to the public, which was something that enabled us to understand something fresh about gender, sex and seafaring. The newspaper article was about 6 paragraphs long, and it's a tiny, useful voicing of a very important matter. Ellen Gibbs' case exposes something on which there was huge silence, which this paper now discusses. People on ships had sex, and having sex had additional consequences for women as reproducers. Slide 8. Here's a definition of women's subjective sexualities which I'm using in this paper. It's about women born women and their sexual feelings, experiences, expressions and attitudes. The woman as she experiences them or says she experiences them as a subject. So it's not about what is attributed to women as object. And this understanding of the importance of women's subjective feelings about sexuality is of course recognised in the new Me Too climate we now have. So women seafarers' subjective sexualities include the following: her own desires, orientation and identity, including, in quotes, femininity, her reproductivity, the negotiation of male-stream heterosexual attitudes towards her attributed features such as her desirability or not, the impact on women seafarers' on-board relationships and careers, and her context in relation to women ashore in a climate that has been one of commodification of women by Jack Tar, who traditionally saw women as a girl in every port, and if he was lucky and they were on ship, a girl on every ship. The main areas of women's subjective sexualities that could be discussed in maritime history, was it inclined to discuss them, include the following. First of all, negotiating being the focus of heightened male projections about sex, and also love and gender and emotions, in a 24/7 goldfish bowl climate, as everybody says, but with the extra surveillance too that comes to women, particularly younger women. Second area is about a woman making her own choices about partners and the types of relationships she has, but doing so in an atmosphere which is very much influenced by The Love Boat, that 1970s onwards TV series where casual sex and adultery are commonplace. Thirdly, dealing with her reproductivity, including menstruation, contraception, and including pressure to delay or terminate pregnancy. Fourthly, we could discuss, and should, handling sexual coercion, especially from superiors, in an isolated residential situation where women don't often have support, particularly if they're the sole woman, and on cargo ships with crews who don't respect women in the ways that some Western men do. Fifthly, negotiating a climate where sexual disease transmission is common and logistically problematic, and has been, though I'm not sure it is now, extra stigmatizing for women. Now, why should historians link sexuality and seafaring? This is, of course, because sexuality has and had heightened importance on ships as opposed to any other workplace, for the following reasons. The separation from loved ones leads to contingent sex acts as a way to perhaps feel more solace, more comfortable with one's life, and to get a sense of agency on a ship where often one is fairly powerless. In male-dominated brotherly communities like the army and the church, it's argued that women can more easily be seen as sexual beings or sexual objects when slid into such communities. In this kind of sexualized role, these rare and fetishized beings, women, then face discrimination, especially as their job status is usually lowly and only domestic. Thirdly, men's potential rivalry, sexual rivalry for women, can be seen as like a lighted match to gunpowder, the ship being a keg, in terms of the stability of the social relations. And that stability has been reason given for centuries to exclude women particularly unaccompanied women rather than women as wives of seafarers, and the Royal Navy's current no-touching rule as an example of this idea that any sex at sea is difficult for the community. The fourth reason is that the Jack Tar figure, who's popularly constructed as hypermasculine and desirous, then has essentially his women who are correspondingly, in theory, primarily hyperfeminine objects, not equal colleagues. So the Jack Tar figure casts women as something that they are not. Slide 12. The relevance of this to the #MeToo movement and to the concept of maritime masculine toxicity is as follows. The #MeToo movement, as we know, began in 2006 and then really took off with Twitter last year in 2018. And this is a useful idea of what it did. It created spaces for women to share their experiences of sexual violence, harassment and objectification, as well as condemning the seeming acceptability of men abusing their positions of power. So, the awareness and change practices created by the #MeToo climate can not only help women today, this very minute, with their difficulties in dealing with situations, but it can aid fuller and more nuanced researching and representing of the maritime past's gendered relations. The MeToo movement's relation to maritime toxic masculinity, the topic of this conference, is that ships have long been situations where sex acts or imagined sex is pivotal, where sexual relations are not always equal, kindly, respectful by any means, and the power that is showed in them is gender-based. Also, representations of sexuality have been veiled in silences and distortions which are not productive of good real relations, nor of good historiographical understandings either. There are four key types of silences on the history of seafaring women's subjective sexualities. Firstly, general outright omissions, which are common when any recorded history talks about women, or rather fails to talk about women. But in maritime history specifically, omissions are partly a product of the real absence of women from seafarers. They always have been a minority, and also of their records from seafaring, because of course they weren't there. Secondly, there are the subtler silences and the failures to understand women's subjectivity from women's perspectives, especially if they're low-status women. So this includes recent accounts written by chivalrous, well-intentioned male naval authors who appear to be uncomfortable about speaking in a straightforward way about female sexuality. The third silence is about rewriting and airbrushing, which is done to avoid offending modern audiences, especially if it talks about bawdiness. So, for example, I was very shocked recently at a maritime museum to come across a volunteer archivist who'd been archiving some songs about sailors and who told me proudly that she had rephrased some non-PC lyrics about a female sailor in order to not be reproducing the abusive remarks about her. So in this way, the truth of attitudes does get obliterated. The fourth type of silence is skewed representations for maritime consumers' consumption. To titillate, to moralise, to excuse male behaviour, and of course they thereby omit women as subjects and indeed sometimes as co-seafarers, for example in the cartoons by Rowlandson and Gilray. These are the main reasons for silences about women's sexuality at sea. Firstly, taboos and conventions about what is seemly or appropriate to discuss in maritime history. Secondly, women's own reticence on the subject. Thirdly, men's unease, ignorance, or embarrassment on the topic. And fourthly, the self-protectiveness of institutions, including the academy, museums, and the industry itself, including the Royal Navy. Why the silence from women in these primary sources? I've identified 7 reasons. Firstly, women's actual absence from seafaring, or their numerical and cultural insignificance on ships. Secondly, the general earlier culture of not discussing one's own sexuality, even with partners, at least so far as we know. Thirdly, women had much lower literacy levels than men. 60% of women were illiterate in 1840, so had they even wanted to write about their sexuality, they wouldn't have been able to. Also, number 4, the problem of saving. Women's letters were less saved and less lodged in public archives than were seamen's, which led to women further doubting their record worthiness and therefore affecting how much they wrote. Fifthly, there's the desire for privacy from invasive and salacious outsiders. Today, tabloid hostility, trolling, social media bullying, and so on mean that women and girls self-protect by not speaking about their sexuality, and that works in conjunction with the silences that still exist today because of embarrassment and poor education about bodies and about sex and reproductivity. So, for example, in the very important hashtag Know Your Body campaign, they do issue Just a Vagina badges so that they're urging that women speak freely and straightforwardly about body parts and about all aspects of life, embodied life. Seventh, some, mainly older women, do not attribute major importance to sexuality. So Gerard de Groot, when he was interviewing army women from World War II, found that one of them said, or protested rather, "We hadn't been brought up to think that sex was the be-all in life." And certainly I too, in working with oral history and older women, have found that they say things like, "We just didn't think about sex like you do these days." Slide 17. Why the silence in secondary works on the maritime past? Partly it's about content. There's the older tendency for books on the maritime past to exclude subjects including women, lower decks personnel, emotions, subjective responses to the social aspects of life. These conventions continue, particularly when publishers see that these kind of books sell. Secondly, there's the problem of form. There is a tradition in maritime historiography of not being interdisciplinary or not including gender studies, sexology, oral history, cultural studies, anecdotal and non-traditional evidence. For example, Facebook and internet-based chat rooms, which certainly have a lot of post-1970 evidence that's very useful to use. Also, there's the oral historian's problem of feeling that they may offend their interviewees, and this is not only a problem in the interviewing relationship, but it also means that your interviewee might not pass you on to other people who can tell you about the subject. So asking too much about sexuality can mean that you reduce your pool of potential interviewees accidentally. There's also the problem of academics' nervousness about being criticised by colleagues and superiors, for example, for being crass, un-PC, irrelevant. There's anxiety about ethics committees which cause people to be evasive, not least because if the institution attracts negative publicity, this could bring consequent funding cuts. And also there's the difficulty that publicly funded museums are required to be family friendly, and talking about sex is a tricky matter. Slide 19. Why sexualities matter in studies of workplaces. Sexual behaviour is a key way that gender relations are expressed anywhere, anytime, and in any workplace. It's a major meeting place for potential partners. To be aware of such a structuring nexus in somebody's 24/7 workplace and home, as a ship is, therefore helps historians understand two things: women's social and subjective positions in workplaces, and the gendered dynamics experienced by women as colleagues and as employees. Slide 20. Sexualities matter to maritime managers, including captains on ships and headquarters staff on land, because women's presence on board is seen as requiring segregation to avoid sexual impropriety. This has a big impact on spaces, including the bathrooms on ships. Secondly, promiscuous sex is a shipboard health issue because disease incapacitates people and makes them unavailable for work. Thirdly, pregnancy and childbirth aboard is a medical problem, especially without a doctor on board, as for example on a cargo ship. Also, having a child affects labour availability, particularly when the ship is short-handed, as in Ellen Gibbs' case. And also, a spouse's presence can cause disruption. Slide 21. Why sexualities matter to seagoing women. Sex, gender and sexuality, especially sexual activity, have heightened importance on ships as opposed to other workplaces because the long separation from loved ones for months or even years on end is and has been such a major issue, especially when it comes to thinking about who gets access to which women and for how long. Those at sea and ashore sometimes choose indiscriminate sex acts as coping strategies for the difficulties of that separation. Sometimes people may exceptionalize adultery and see it as okay, and also treat sex as light recreation. Sometimes sexual expression appears to get mixed up with idealized love of home, and also with fuzzy boundaries where comradeship slips into sex and sometimes into sentimental fantasy too. Women were, I'm not sure if they still are, a focus of fetishistic attention based on ideas that the sex act is a natural release for pent-up energy, which therefore positions women as a receptacle for male waste. Also, there's the complex mix of hypermobility, travel and what seems to be hardwiring, that away from familial ties there's evidence that men, rather than women, tend to experiment and feel impelled by loosened up ideas about morality to have casual and informal relationships that they wouldn't have if they were near a home. And this pattern can be at odds with women's affiliative needs, which are part of the hardwiring, which we could argue about, of course. Part 4. Silences about the endings. This is slide 23. Industry initiatives now give clues to the hidden past. So the civic rights aware initiatives that are happening today to change maritime culture include ending sexually abusive behaviour, outlawing mandatory pregnancy testing, and halting discriminatory practices. Some of these initiatives today are organised by the following organisations: the International Labour Organization and the International Maritime Organization, which has a very important Women in Maritime programme and has had this from 1988. It continues to be important. Nautilus, the Merchant Navy Officers Union, and its Women's Forum are in the forefront of investigating and protesting against discrimination against women, and also many organisations in the industry, including the Professional Yachting Association, which found that 40% of yacht crew had unwanted sexual contact last year. These industry organisations, including the Royal Navy with its protocol guides and training, are all working to change the situation. And of course, in talking about change, they're talking about what happens, so we get a glimpse of what is happening in maritime life, which helps us think about what has happened. Slide 24, speaking out about sexuality and abuse. On ships, sexually abusive situations disproportionately occur, and it's part of the bullying climate that is now being stamped out as much as possible. A key example of this is in 2010, when an East African cadet was thought to have been raped and murdered aboard the ship on which she was working. The case has never been cleared up, but what is important is that global attention followed, and this was to the sexual abuse of vulnerable cadets, women and men alike, who were the targets of attention by coercive attention by officers. Relatedly, attention is now also being paid to cruise ship sex crime, which is under-investigated and under-resolved, but appears to be committed by male crew who have paid sex with older women passengers. Slide 25. I want to talk now about one of the representations of the past that is happening now and is an important development. This is the Sex and the Sea exhibition. It was commissioned and was first on in Rotterdam Maritime Museum in 2014. It's now moved on to Tallinn Maritime Museum in Estonia in 2019. Now, although this is mainly about women as objects, not subjects, including figureheads and beloveds, and about sex that seamen pay for, and about oceanic feelings in the sex act, it is also an opening up of the subject, which hasn't happened before, and is taking place in a very family-friendly museum and has been extremely well received. Slide 26, academic attention. A very important initiative occurred in 2016. Oxford Brookes University in the UK organised a Maritime Masculinities 1815 to 1914 conference. At this conference, sex was discussed in a way it never had been before in the maritime historiography world. The keynote speech was by Dr. Mary Conley. Her title was Looking for Sex in the Naval Archives, the Challenges of Researching Naval Sexualities in the 20th Century. One of the other papers there was by Alison Twells. Her paper was called Do You Have a Snap of Yourself in School Uniform or Are You Shy? Intemperate Masculinity in Britain during World War II. And this was about a very important case of the grooming that grew out of a move promoted by schools and government to encourage students to become pen pals with seafarers, with the inevitable sexual consequences in some cases. Slide 26, temporary moorings, or what you might call a conclusion. So moving from Ellen Gibbs' absent no sex at sea contract to the Me Too movement today. This paper has discussed how awareness of sexuality, a central but occluded feature of seafaring, has been enabled by some of the following initiatives: the women-led Me Too culture, the growing general frankness in discussing sexuality, including sex in history, the current industry recognition of oppressive attitudes and practices and the struggle to change that, and a new recognition of gender and of masculinity, and therefore femininity, by maritime historiographers today. So I, as the author, I don't contend that all males at all times were toxic, but the silence about onboard failure to respect women as equals and subjects has been toxic, in my view. So representing the history of sex on ships, and doing so in a new women-centred way, can be an important addition to Mar Hist, maritime historiography. Slide 28, my final slide. Thank you very much for listening, and I really look forward to contact with you if you want to talk about this subject, and I look forward to work happening about women's sexuality at sea. I'd like to end with this cartoon because I think it sums up so much of what I've been saying. Here is this chap who doesn't get it saying, "Well, and what's a girl like you doing on a ship like this?" And the woman he's addressing is completely not rising to it. She says simply, "Commanding it." Thank you.